Let's save the planet has become an unofficial tagline for the climate movement. But as many people have pointed out, the Earth will continue to revolve around the sun long after we're gone. What's not guaranteed is our future here, our ability to withstand more intense natural disasters, to accommodate climate refugees, and to feed billions on drought-stricken lands. So, in these next back-to-back panels, our speakers will explore how to safeguard humanity's future on this planet, protecting lives and livelihoods through adaptation and mitigation. In the first panel, which approaches the topic from a global perspective, we'll hear from CEO of the European Climate Foundation and one of the key architects of the landmark Paris Agreement, Laurence Toubiana, the author of The Intersectional Environmentalist, who's an American climate activist known for linking social justice and environmentalism, Leah Thomas, and the CEO of the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, Kate Hampton. Then, right on the heels of that conversation, we'll have another set of experts ready to pivot to more local adaptation and mitigation plans. Those speakers are the key Indian climate change negotiator and spokesperson at the 2015 Paris negotiations, Ajay Mathur, an Ecuadorian human rights activist who's adamantly defended her community's Amazon land against encroaching private oil interests, Helena Gwalinga, and the UN resident coordinator in Uganda, Susan Namando Ngongi. Here to moderate both panels is the co-coordinator for the Regional Youth-Led Climate Change Network, 350 Fiji, who also happens to be a member of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. Take it away, Ernest Gibson.
Nisam Bolavanaka, and welcome to the panel on climate change. Now we're looking at the global perspectives, and we have three wonderful people who we'll be having a conversation with. If you don't mind, Leah, I'd like to start the conversation by quickly turning it over to you. And I mean, a classic question that you must get quite regularly is around what it means to be a youth activist. So I would love to hear in your own words what youth activism means to you and what it looks like.
Absolutely. And this is always an interesting question because I'm actually in my late 20s. So when I came into the climate space, I had studied environmental science and policy, dabbled as a National Park Service Ranger intern, looked into environmental nonprofits, and was just really fascinated with different ways to get involved in sustainability and environmentalism. And then in 2020, when I started talking about intersectional environmentalism, I met a lot of incredible youth activists that started protesting probably when they were 13 or 14. So I learned a lot about their experiences, which looked a little bit different from my own, because in many ways, I feel like I was able to have a childhood, and even so much of my college experience, I was protesting, but it looks a little bit different when people are starting at 13 and 14. And I feel like, you know, while they are making incredible friends advocating for the planet, that's a quite different experience starting when you're really young. So for me, even though I am still close in age to a lot of youth activists, it's kind of funny that they've positioned me as like their auntie, even though I'm still in my 20s. But I feel like at this phase, I want to make sure that everyone who's involved in climate, they still get to have their childhood, find joy, because, you know, there's a lot of eco-anxiety when it comes to being a younger person advocating for the planet in this space.
Thanks for sharing that. I love that. And I love that you talk about how you can be a youth activist and join the fight at any point, right? There's no like mold that you need to start at 13 or you need to start at 18. You could join the fight at 75, and your contribution will be as valid as anyone else's. And I think that's incredibly important. And Laurence, I'd like to turn over to you now, if you don't mind. And I mean, as somebody who's had an incredible career, continuing to make strides, I'm curious to understand, in terms of climate action and policy, what are some of the things that you've seen over the course of your career around ensuring a sustainable future that you would like to highlight as sort of these big milestones?
I love looking at the auntie, which is still so young. And if you are auntie, I am the grandmother of all this. So, and it's very nice. You're totally right, Ernest, to say we can enter in the climate movement at any age. And I feel super energized by all these young people coming in. So that's a big difference along the career to have seen that concern, and I feel very strongly the problem of having a joyful childhood and not just thinking about the potential and real catastrophes coming in. But at the same time, there is a lot of drive and energy and joy in the movement itself. And that is really resonating with all of us. We have been really working for so long. And in a way, not even looking at back of all this career, where I began to really work on climate change in 1997, so too long ago. We see really since Paris, for example, this 2015, only 7 years, and we have, again, and my message, of course, is totally ambiguous. On one side, I think many things are moving, in particular this one, the perception of society, of citizen, of youth. And on the other side, we are going too slow. So there are movements, there are progress, there are concern. You now most of the big companies, all the governments are talking about net zero emission by 2050. There is a more concern about adaptation and really the catastrophes and the result on the societies. In a way, this is real and much more real than it was in 1997 or even in Paris Agreement in 2015. And that's true that now 90% of the global GDP is covered by net zero target. And we have in Europe a Green Deal that is really all of the government approach with clear targets, very, very specific policy. So this is good. But and at the same time, you see that the actual crisis, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, shake all the consensus or the progress. We are, again, too slow progress anyway, but now even more with this political and military and humanitarian crisis, by the way. And that's where I think it's important that the society keeps on and saying that we should not derail the direction of travel, and at least we have to accelerate. And in a way, that's good because now energy security is much more assimilated with renewable energy, which is really a progress. But I'm concerned, of course, and it's good that the US now are, in a way, with a policy to reduce emissions more seriously than before. You see that China has had quite good goods and good policies which are implemented. But at the same time, we see that the actual crisis just allow for probably a backtrack, and we have to be conscious of that, or preparing Sharm el-Sheikh. The second element is really now that the climate extreme event linked to climate has been really terrible. We see Pakistan, what Antonio Guterres, United Nations Secretary, spoke about the carnage and the climate carnage. But it's not only in Pakistan, it's everywhere. And everywhere people are displaced, combine all the crises makes the situation very, very difficult. So my main trust, my main confidence in the society movement or societal movement, because government would go back and forth and they are never ahead of their society. So that's why it's really important to have like the citizen assemblies or whatever forms the citizen mobilization is taking. We should not let go by fatalism and just beginning really afraid of what is coming, but at the other way, be really agency, and the society's movement will finally push the government in the right direction. So I bet everything on citizen and youth and movements much more than any company or government policy.
I think that's an extremely safe bet. And I think something that you say that really resonates with me is that the climate movement and the societal movement is tough work. It can also be disenfranchising when you see that sometimes you feel like you're making strides, but actually it can also feel like you're running on the spot. But it's all those things, but there's also an enormous amount of energy that you can get from the movement. And that's something that I don't think is something you can experience unless you're finding ways of engaging with young people, with Indigenous peoples, with people that have their heart in the right place. And that's something that allows us to all continue to keep going. And now that we're talking about energy and energizing and the future, I see Kate smiling. I think she knows where we're going with this conversation. And I think it's really important that we can now think about the ways in which we introduce, and bring children into this conversation. So, I mean, the question that I have for you, Kate, is around why you've approached philanthropy through the prism of improving children's lives at scale, but using climate as the entry point.
Thanks, Ernest, and it's lovely to see Léa and Laurence. I mean, it's a terrible cliche that politicians use all the time. Children are the future of our nation. Children are the future of whatever community they're speaking about. But the great tragedy is that children are usually not at the table, or their allies are not at the table. And children are in many ways an important proxy for what is going to happen over the next few decades. The formative years of children's growing up, their nutrition, their education, all of these things will have an impact on society for decades. And there's a quote from Nelson Mandela, which I love, which is something along the lines of, there's no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way it treats its children. And I think it's important because children connect us. They connect us to something deep inside us. They connect us with love. Everybody, whether they're parents or not, have small people in their lives that they cherish. And children they always get shortchanged in societies which are very short-term by nature. Political cycles are short-term in their nature. Financial markets are short-term in their nature. And so bringing that perspective of children and intergenerational justice is absolutely crucial. And increasingly, as Les was saying, we are actually seeing children advocate for themselves. So not just children's allies, but children themselves are coming to the fore. But that also brings huge risks to those children. Very, very young people on the streets, in some places exposed to harassment, either by authorities or by adults that would wish them ill. And so that, of course, carries risks. But as Laurence has said, it has been the driving force of the climate movement for the last few years, having children at the table more and more, and participating in the conversation. But I think it does require a rethink of how we approach some of these issues. There's a lot of tokenism around the representation of children. Like Indigenous peoples, they're often wheeled into conferences to make a wonderful speech towards the end of the conference, but the meaningful engagement, the capacity building, the listening, that's often not happening in between these big set piece events. So for us, climate change, like all the other issues that affect children so profoundly, we really need a rethink about how we engage them and engage young people in the conversations and give them a sense of agency and a sense of hope to enable them to live joyful childhoods, as Leah so eloquently mentioned earlier.
Thanks, Kim. I think you've touched on something that I think is really important, that it's not just about children as individuals and themselves, but also the importance of ensuring allies are included in these spaces. And I love that, because it's the same thing in the youth movement, right? It's not just about young people being involved. It's around ensuring that people that champion youth, that find ways of ensuring that youth are connected to opportunities, are also part of that conversation. My mother has recently become a grandmother of a 6-month-old, and I think that this is a really good way of exemplifying that, because she says babies cry for 2 reasons. They're uncomfortable or they want something, and babies don't lie. And so in many ways, I think she's kind of the ally of my little nephew. And he's the child that is this representation of the future, and finding ways of ensuring that his parents know that if he's crying, he needs to be changed or he needs to be fed. And it's as simple as that, right? It's around ensuring that we're listening to the cries and the voices of young people, but that there's always somebody there to continue to uplift them, especially in spaces when they tend to be marginalized or tokenized. I'm going to turn back to you now, Leah, if you don't mind. And I really want to kind of get a sense of what your picture of what a truly sustainable and transformative future looks like. If you could paint a picture for us.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I know that there's never going to be a perfect world, but I love the phrase that if you shoot for the moon, you might land on a star. And there are so many stars that we can land on that I feel like would be so much greater. But what I feel like is in that future for me is making sure that everyone has their, and this shouldn't be controversial, but their basic human environmental needs that should be right. So access to things like clean air and clean water. I also think having diverse leadership within the environmental movement, which I feel like is happening, whether we're talking about grassroots organizing or in different political areas, leadership is becoming more diverse, but we definitely need more representation of the world's Indigenous peoples at all stages of the government. So yeah, I think that's what I'm asking for right now, just making sure that we are protecting and uplifting Indigenous voices and making sure everyone has access to breathe clean air and drink clean water and live in a safe and healthy environment. And these are things that shouldn't be controversial and arguably are needed by everyone to not only survive, but experience joy, which is something that I also would like in that future.
Yeah. And I think that sometimes we undercut humanity when we start to ignore things like joy and happiness, and something that Kate touched on earlier around ensuring that there is a level of love that exists. Because if you don't have any of these things, then you can ask the question, what are we actually building a better world for if we're not finding a quality of life that is acceptable to everybody? And I'll be honest, the asks that you have are very simple, but sometimes it's almost extremely difficult to get leaders to be able to agree to that vision. And it starts to beg the question about why? Well, why is it so difficult to ensure that the lives of people can't be changed for the better? Yeah. And so, Laurence, I think this kind of is a great segue into my next question for you, which is, what do you think needs to be done? And if you could maybe give us an example of how everyday people can find ways of ensuring that we can influence leaders, influence our governments, influence businesses and other key stakeholders to ensure that this vision that Leah's talked about is something that's realized, that we do land on that star.
I think there is a multiple ways, and probably a need, of course, to be active and responsible citizen to achieve all these dimensions. I think the citizen in the society can put the pressure on the ones who are delaying action, because of course that's something they are good at, frankly, all the time. So it's a sort of continuous work. And there is, of course, some evident thing like has happened already, that the consumer choice and people can make that could give a clear signal. So against the greenwashing of certain company or overconsumption of some goods. And I think that now, in particular in the younger generation, you feel it very, very strongly. People would not like to buy the same thing. They are thinking twice if they to fly. They are really more sensitive to each other connection. So anyway, in particular for the people who have more acquisitive power, it is in my view, responsibility to have a responsible consumer choices. But more than that, I think the citizen has to be a watchdog, because there is so many commitments. Net zero, well, I was saying 90% of the countries now have a net zero target of countries. There are many on companies. Financial institutions are proud to say that sometimes they are even already carbon neutral. But all this is really a greenwashing. And I think the citizen can root out, really be strong and say, it's not, we want truth, we want sincerity, because honesty and sincerity, it's the only way we can get there, because lies would not do anything against climate change. And it makes all of us lose time in this run against time we are facing. So I do think that the citizens have to be the watchdogs. They have to look at and ask for information, make all these layers of power accountable. And I think they have resources to do that, but we have to build that resources too. And Kate was referring to the necessity to offer support for the young generation in particular, because and that was interesting to hear you previously. You have had the time to make studies, to run your curriculum. Many of the young people are just launching their action, and with a very, very young age. And you need support and training and information at a moment where normally you should do something else, probably. So I think that's a responsibility. And I think we should be now asking every day, do your net zero is a true zero, and demonstrate that it's real, demonstrate you are reducing emission. And if not, I think it's good you can go to litigation. I see that even in Russia today, there will be NGOs and associations that are suing the Russian government. Imagine the courage to say you are destroying the climate. So I think this courage that is there in the society, we have many ways to strengthen that. And I think that's why I think that, as you said, Ernest, it's a safe bet. It's a safer bet we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's around ensuring that we have the audacity to know that we deserve better and demand it. And the only way we can do that is if we work together and we kind of leverage off of our collective strengths. I'm going to turn to you for this last part, Kate, to round up this conversation. And the question really is around the low carbon world. And I'm curious to just one example of who needs to do what to ensure that we're on the right path. If you could give one example.
I think what's frightening at the moment is that we've got layer upon layer of crisis. So many people are struggling to feed themselves, to heat their homes, or have cool their homes, depending where they live. So the cost of living crisis, and upon that we have war and the impacts of war, both near and far. We also have the scarring from COVID. A whole generation of children who've been out of school for too long, and that will have long-lasting impacts. Tax receipts are down in many countries. Debt is piling up in many countries. And so we have a financial crisis emerging on top of what was already a social crisis and an environmental crisis. And all of these things are feeding off each other. And the politics of polarization and alienation and making people turn inwards. So I think we have to, building a little bit on what we've said so far, citizens have to be at the forefront of creating an alternative narrative, a narrative that's not about guns and walls, a narrative that's about collective solidarity and responsibility. Communities start taking action, everybody becomes an activist. We all, in every aspect of our lives, find an agenda where we can move things forward. And these collaborations across different movements, across different geographies, are so crucial at a time when governments are in many ways fracturing. Societies need to reach across boundaries and really try and make the collective action that we need on climate change possible. Laurence is absolutely right that accountability and authenticity is crucial. It's a really important role for civil society to play. But in a world where the attention of politicians and senior decision makers is taken up by so many issues, we also have to find a way to bring intersectional approaches that address multiple concerns at the same time to the table. And that means movements coming together with other movements to address collective problems. And that sounds potentially like a vague answer. Maybe people were expecting me to talk about more investment in renewables or decarbonization of the steel sector. All of those things are true, but the solutions and the resources are not the obstacle. There's plenty of money in the world. It's being spent on the wrong things. What we really need to do is mobilize the will, and that will ultimately come from collaboration, global, local, multi-sectoral, intersectional. That is what's going to transform the politics.
Awesome. What a powerful way to round up this conversation, Kate. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to everybody for really choosing to invest your time in, as Kate would call it, the right investment of your time in today's conversation. Nisam Bolavanaka, and thank you for joining us in the local panel discussing climate action. We're at that point where we're now discussing the big how questions. We know that urgent climate action is required. We know that a just transition must take place we know that a focus is needed on the most vulnerable communities and populations. These things are inevitable and non-negotiable. We're now faced with the challenge of chartering and navigating a course that ensures that these things take place without leaving anybody behind, but also ensuring that we all have the opportunity to reach our full potential in the climate fight. Because as we know, this is something that requires all our action: governments, civil society, the private sector, communities, and in particular, the support and guidance of Indigenous communities. I'd like to start this conversation by turning over to you, Ajay, if that's okay. And I'm going to ask you the kind of probably a particularly big question, but the question is really around solar energy. I come from a part of the world where solar energy, in terms of sun, we are plentiful in that resource. In terms of the tech to be able to take that energy and then transform it into a viable energy source for people, it tends to be a bit of an expensive thing. So my question to you is a very simple but big question around how viable solar is, and how you see it as the future.
Ernest, solar electricity today is, in many geographies and countries, cheapest electricity that you can. Yes, there is a problem, it's not available 24 hours. But when it is available, when the sun is shining, it is the cheapest form of electricity. This is a huge plus point, because what it does is it allows you and me to invest in solar energy and get cheaper electricity from solar than we can get from any other sources, including the grid. What it also does, it makes sure that your energy costs are frozen for a long period. Yes, there is a problem that because it is expensive, in the poorest countries, people are not able to afford it. And hence, the countries which have the greatest resource, the people who have access to the best solar resource, often are not able to use solar energy. This, to me, is the greatest challenge that we face. Cheap electricity, but at the same time, an inability to use it.
Yeah, that's an incredible start to this conversation, I think, because that's probably a part of the conversation that we don't necessarily always hear. Now, I'm curious if I could turn over to Helena, because I know Helena is one of those people that's regularly in the field, regularly in contact with people on the ground, and also is driven a lot by Indigenous movements. So I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about some of the work that you do, particularly around ensuring that people's rights are maintained and supported and protected during the climate fight, and especially as we're moving towards through the just transition. So Helena, over to you.
Thank you so much. I think we need to understand that we cannot just only focus on environmentalism and sustainability and the just transition and not take into account human rights, because they go hand in hand together. If we do not respect Indigenous people's rights, we cannot protect, for example, the Amazon rainforest where I come from. That is just reality. But if we do not protect the Amazon, we're also putting in danger an entire population of Indigenous people. And that is what our work is around, because we need to ensure Indigenous people our basic human rights. We need to ensure Indigenous people the guarantee to safety when we stand up against extractive industries. And this is not only, when we're talking about the fossil fuel industry, it's also when we're talking about the renewable energy industry, because now in the next years, that is what's going to be affecting Indigenous communities the most when we leave the fossil fuel industry behind. And we need to take that into account, because when we're talking about sustainable energy, whose lands are we gonna be, extracting from now? And I always say this, is this a way of, again, punishing Indigenous people for having protected lands for centuries, for decades, and for thousands of years? Is this, again, punishing Indigenous people?
Thanks so much for shedding a light on that, Helena. And you made a fantastic point around intersectionality. We can't just pick and choose the things that we want to solve, right? This is where everything is connected via this system, that we need to find ways of ensuring everything is being championed. And I can see that our resident coordinator on the call, Susan, is nodding her head, because I feel like she knows that the conversation is currently going to be steered to her now. Because what better way to talk about intersectionality than from somebody who leads an entire UN country team? So, I mean, yours is a two-part question in this instance, Susan. Could you talk to us about what that means when as you're managing an entire UN country team to try and ensure that everybody in the choir is singing in the perfect harmony? And also what this COP27, which will be the first COP in Africa, means, and what we really need to achieve at this COP.
Well, the first thing about the country team is we are beginning to understand that this is a crisis, and we all have to act as if it's a crisis. So getting the UN family really to respond to it as a crisis. In Uganda, for instance, one of the ways that we're beginning to respond is through actually young people and jobs. That's one of the big opportunities we see, because in Uganda's case, you know, it's one of the youngest populations in the world. 77% of the population is under 30, about 46 million people is under 30, and we recognize that the jobs are not there for them. So part of the thinking now, of course, is how do we help build an ecosystem that will support their entrepreneurship? They will have to make their own jobs. So in this now, with the climate crisis, it's how to make sure that the jobs that they are making for themselves are actually green jobs, climate-friendly jobs. So I think in terms of the country team is really trying to find ways of making sure that, you know, we seize opportunities that are in front of us to actually respond credibly. COP27, I think, is going to be a huge part of it will be adaptation. In 2022, we've seen all these adverse climate, extreme climate events everywhere. In Uganda, we've had our fair share. Every week we have a mudslide, we have flash floods. We're also managing droughts in parts of the country. So I think all minds are really focused on, well, how do we better build resilience so that we can deal with these adverse events? We know they will continue because we haven't changed the formula on the emissions front enough yet. So how do we build better resilience? So I think adaptation and financing for them will be one of the key things at COP. And I hope something else that shows up at COP, I'm not sure if we're there yet, is really a better narrative. A better narrative, as you were saying, it's urgent. A better narrative that englobes all of us about the urgency and why we're all in it together.
Yeah, I fully agree with you there. I think the importance of ensuring that narrative is framed, but it's also incredibly strong, and is our guiding light at this point, right? We can no longer keep talking about climate change as something in the future, or the climate crisis, or the impacts on Indigenous populations as something that's this distant thing that may happen at some point in time. It's something that's happening now to communities all over the world. Ajay, if you don't mind, I'd like to turn back to you and ask you another bit of a hard talk question. And because Susan's brought up the COP27 and has talked about the processes and the incredible opportunities that are available, I think something that we see time and time again and can be deflating within youth movements and within climate movements across the world is sometimes it's very hard to hold governments accountable to the commitments that they make at these big international fora, because that's not the tough part, right? The tough part's not making the big commitment. The tough part is following up on the big commitment. So my question to you is, how do we ensure that we can empower young people, empower the climate movement to ensure that we're holding our governments to account, particularly in the promises that they've made in the energy transition sector?
Ernest, the Paris Agreement and all succeeding agreements are based on trust. And if they're based on trust, then we need to have the mechanisms to check, keep people, make sure that they deliver on their pledges. So if they've made pledges regarding how much money they will do, we need transparent mechanisms on how these resources are made. I'll give you an example. A lot of the trust in this world, in the energy transition world, is based on resources being made available for the solar industry. Where is this? Yes, on the one hand, we have had about 200 gigawatts established in 2021, but 74% of it was established in the OECD countries and China. Why? Because that is where investors felt comfortable. They had levels of risk which they were comfortable. We need the developed world to provide the resources, to create the risk mitigation funds so that monies will flow into the least developed countries and the developing countries. That is the only way we will see global solarization occurring. I urge all countries of the world to create these risk mitigation funds to help money flow into countries where it is not flowing.
Absolutely, and I mean that's the beauty and the difficulty about these kinds of agreements, right? That they are built on trust, because sometimes it's one of the hardest things to build and one of the easiest things to destroy. So it's finding ways of ensuring we're striking that balance around fostering trust within the relationships across the multiple sectors. Helena, if you don't mind, I'd love to turn to you again and really ask around how we can spark local action. But then critically, how we can then move towards scaling that towards some kind of global action. And I'm curious to maybe hear an example from your line of work that you'd be willing to share.
Of course. Well, everything that we in the Amazon or in indigenous territories are working on essentially affects the entire world. If our lands are plundered, if our lands are destroyed in one way or another, it's going to have an effect on, globally, and whether it's climate or in any other way. I personally live in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and it's basically the headwaters of the entire Amazon basin. It's basically where the Amazon starts. So everything that happens here will affect the entire Amazon. Just 2 years ago, there was a massive oil spill, one of the biggest ones we've ever seen in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And when that oil spill happened, in 2 days, it had already reached Peru. So if that gives you an idea of the magnitude of impact this place has on this ecosystem, but also on the entire world. So the work that is being done here in protecting natural areas, in protecting biodiversity, territories, water, it does have an effect on the global climate and the entire world. And that is why indigenous people are working on this. It's one thing is protecting our lives and one thing and our lives and our traditional lifestyle, and another thing is also knowing that there is this weight on us that the entire world also depends on our ecosystem. But the movements that are happening here have also in some way spread to other parts of the world, and I think that has been very beautiful to see how what is happening here is also creating impact in other parts of the world.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Helena. And I think we like to pretend that the world is bigger than it is, right? Mm-hmm. But actually there are so many things that connect us. And unfortunately, it's not only the good things that connect us. And when one of us hurts, we all hurt. And so it's finding ways of ensuring that we move together, that we protect the most vulnerable, that we support those that need our support, but also that together we hold people who are misbehaving to account, right? Because that's the only way that we can do it. We can only do it if we do it together. In the spirit of doing things together and in the spirit of ensuring that we are moving as one unit, I'd like to turn back to you, Susan, and ask the maybe you could provide us with a bit of a definition around what leaving no one behind means, and what that looks like in the context of a country team, and what that can look like at a local level, but also as we scale through to some more national efforts.
I think as we understand it, leaving no one behind means that everybody in a country is sharing in the development progress that is being made. Unfortunately, what we can see, the models that we've been implementing is that, well, some people, there's massive inequalities and some people benefit more than others. So leaving no one behind is making sure that everybody's sharing in the progress. Everybody is sharing in that economic growth. Everybody is sharing in the social and cultural progress that's being made. And I think as regards climate change really is what we need a lot of pressure from populations towards their governments to make sure that these changes are made. I think we need massive education also. We take it for granted that we all understand the urgency. I think the extreme climate events we're all facing makes it easier to understand. But I think we also have to make sure that everybody fully understands, what the future will look like very quickly if we don't get to 1.5 and we don't maintain it. So education, I think, is massively important.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm going to ask the same question, because as we're getting kind of towards the end of our time, so I'm going to ask the same question to both Ajay and Helena as well, around what leaving no one behind looks like to you. Because I think that we've seen, we see this used regularly, but in terms of what it looks like in practice, it's really important for us to be able to knuckle down on what that narrative really is. So I'll start with you, Ajay, and then I'll move over to Helena to close a little bit.
Ernest, I'll repeat what I said earlier. It bothers me and it bothers the International Solar Alliance that we have seen an extremely skewed nature of solar development. There are countries which are getting a lot of solar capacity installed, and there are other countries which are not getting any. All of Africa, for example, got 0.5% of the solar capacity last year. This needs to be corrected. Leaving no one behind means that everybody has access to solar energy.
Awesome. Helena?
I think leaving no one behind goes much further than what we can imagine that the climate change will look like. Climate change will have an impact in ways that we cannot yet understand or even measure or imagine. So leaving no one behind will make sure that we can close all those gaps that we do not yet understand. And that is a task that is very, very hard. It will impact our economy, it will impact our education, it will impact healthcare, it will impact our environment in a way that we already see that is disastrous. So leaving no one behind is making sure that we can protect ourselves from the effects of climate change, not just what will come in the environment, but how it's the social impacts that this will have. And we all know that the most vulnerable ones are the ones that are going to be most affected. So how do we make sure that we can close that gap? Because we're talking about climate change affects us all, but it does not affect us all in the same amount. So how can we make sure that even if this is happening, the most vulnerable ones also have support, also, have access to stability as we go through this crisis?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us today. And I've really appreciated the insights that you've been able to share. But I would like to leave you with the thoughts that Susan shared around leaving no one behind, around ensuring that everybody has access to share in the wealth of development. And this is something that we need to continue to champion. It's like when you're at a big party, right? And there's always somebody that isn't necessarily eating, but there's always going to be that one auntie or that one mother that comes around with a big pot of food and says, "You're not having enough, and I'm going to fill up your plate." And that's what we need. We need people that are always there to fill up our cup and always there to fill up our plate, ensuring that everybody is full, ensuring that everybody has equal access to opportunity, because sometimes you're a little bit shy, and in Fiji the word is mandua, and you're too scared to speak up and say that this is what you want. And sometimes you just need somebody to put that extra spoon of food on your plate because they know you want it, but you're too shy to say it. So ensuring that we are all able to share in that big pot. So thank you very much, and wish you all a wonderful rest of the day. Once again, I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us today, and all of you who've been joining us from all around the world for choosing to invest your time in listening to today's conversation. And we hope that you will continue this conversation in the many things that you will be doing in the future. But just to recap on some of the things that we spoke about in today's session, we talked about the power of people movements and the ability to leverage off of our collective strength. Understanding that the only way forward is if we join hands and do so together. We also spoke about the undoubted transition that will and must take place, and that the thing that we have an opportunity to make a choice about now is how just that transition is going to be, and what a just transition looks like for all of us, and ensuring that when we do make this inevitable leap, that we're doing so together, that we do so in mind with those that may not have the same privileges that we do. We also spoke about the importance of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities in the climate fight, recognizing that Indigenous communities have had the most successful relationship between people and environment, and that they have a richness that they must teach us. So finding ways of learning from that strength of Indigenous communities. We spoke about what deliberate inclusion looks like, and that it's necessary for the success of all the work that we do. That inclusion no longer looks like, and should never have looked like, ticking a box. That inclusion is around ensuring that we're finding ways of allowing people to tell their own narratives, but have the opportunity to also access ways that they can influence change. We talked about what leaving nobody behind means, but most importantly, we also spoke about what leaving no one behind looks like. It's ensuring that we fight for the inclusion of those that are the most marginalized. Recognizing that there are privileges that we all have access to, and that we must find ways of using these for the betterment of everybody else and the lives and the quality of life of the world. We spoke about the beauty of activism and how activism takes many different forms, and that importantly, all those forms contribute to climate success. And that whether you are a 14-year-old activist or a 75-year-old activist, you have an opportunity to influence change, and we must find ways of supporting that and connecting goodness to goodness. We also spoke about what it means to be an ally, and that it is incredibly important that we find ways of ensuring that allies are also included in this conversation. And finally, we talked about how the work that we do in the climate space is tough. It can be disenfranchising. It can sometimes feel like a slap in the face, but we must never let us get that down. Let that get us down. We must ensure that we find ways of seeing the beauty in the work that we do. Find ways of embracing it, and ensure that you and I have the opportunity to work together to build a better future. Thank you very much for joining us.